For as much as Pokemon has the reputation for not wanting to change too much, it's undeniable that every generation has mechanics that can make or break certain parts of the game in ways that the previous entry clearly didn't. This goes for both your in-game single-player content and competitive battling. There's always something you can point at that you like or don't like about each generation. And today, I'll be going over what we believe to be the worst mechanics of every Pokemon generation. Now, what will constitute as a mechanic may be a bit vague here, as I don't want to be limited to just battle features or a few on-field options. We tried to think of everything, like the removal of quality of life features, a difficulty problem, or a generation using an already existing mechanic only to make it worse than before, or even something like an unneeded nerf or some other oddity that was rightfully received negatively. But before we get into it, y'all know the Miss Maggiest plug. Heartgold Randomizer Hardcore Nuzlocke, link will be in the description below. Anyways, let's get right into it. So, Gen 1. It's a weird one to think about in this context, since every mechanic and aspect of the game could technically be considered new. So a lot of things could be labeled as the worst mechanic here. Gen 1 has a lot of unforgiving learn sets, balance issues, and the like. But I think the outright worst mechanic might actually be one that's bad without needing any of the game's infamous glitches or programming oversights. And that's the freeze mechanic. In Gen 1, if your Pokemon gets frozen, you can only be thawed by getting hit by a fire attack like Flamethrower. So basically, if you get frozen in any competitive match, that Pokemon is done for. Sure, this isn't as bad as in single player where you can use an item, but I still think it's probably the closest Gen 1 has to having an outright objectively bad mechanic. It's even worse in the Japanese versions of these games, where Blizzard has a 30% chance to freeze instead of 10%, as if the 90% accuracy wasn't already crazy enough for it back then. Now, while that's my pick for the worst, I'll of course give a shout out to the typing balance of the game, which is pretty rough. You may think the worst of it are normal and psychic types being too powerful, but I think the bigger problem is how underpowered the other typings feel. Fire, Bug, Poison, and Fighting feel either underdeveloped or just bad in Red, Blue, and Yellow. Next up is Gen 2. We had a ton of improvements and changes, from battle mechanics to even your item bag. But when it comes to the worst, I think it's the level curve. Maybe it's a bit ambiguous to call it a mechanic, but it's what I feel safe going with, as I think it's the easiest part of GSC to criticize, at least from a single player gameplay view. I think it's at its weirdest when you enter Kanto, as most of that region is ridiculously easy because of the weird levels. And then Red will suddenly be insanely highly leveled in comparison, though that's not as bad since he is supposed to be the super boss battle saved for the very end of the postgame. So it is better than him being a pushover. If this isn't enough for you, then I'll throw two more. The game being a bit too slow-paced when it comes to battles, more specifically in competitive. In competitive Gen 2, matches have a much higher turn count than the other generations, even more than Gen 1, which was already partly long due to the common use of Chansey in standard formats and a lack of field hazards. Also, the lack of good items available meant that almost every Pokemon used leftovers. The other issue for Gen 2 is that a lot of the cooler new mons aren't available in Kanto, which was always pretty weird. But that one isn't inherently bad as far as mechanics go, and is more of a subjective issue as far as how much it will affect your enjoyment in your playthrough. Moving on to Generation 3, and I know immediately what the worst thing is for a lot of us. The HMs. Too much water, boys. Not only is 8 HMs just miserable, but the fact that 3 of them are water is insane. This was already bad in Gen 2, which also had 3 water HMs, but the fact that you need them more often, and they didn't seem to learn their lesson from the previous game, is pretty awful. The fact that Hoenn has a bunch of water areas to it is not a bad thing at all. It's actually really cool. But the reliance on HMs taking up move slots because of that really sucks. I like the idea of HMs to a certain extent, but it's crazy to think that this mechanic was actually getting worse and worse after Gen 1. At least in Gen 3, more water Pokemon could learn all 3 water HMs, whereas in Gen 2, your own water starter couldn't learn all 3. But is that what people really wanted? Your water Pokemon of choice to be an HM slave? Even if some of the water moves are good? Nah. For a dishonorable mention, I'll point out the fact that you couldn't trade or transfer your Pokemon from GSC or RBY to Gen 3, which was pretty controversial at the time. I do understand why this was, of course, as it was kind of a reboot for the series, including a reboot to the structure of Pokemon's stats, so it would have been challenging to find a compromise at the time. Unfortunately, for Gen 4, I'm gonna have to repeat myself and say the HMs again. Some argue that these are worse than Gen 3, but it's debatable, as this time they're a little more diverse in typing, at least until the Johto remakes. Then the 3 of them were water again. The requirement to use these feels worse though. It feels like I had to deal with having these HMs on hand more often, and finding 6 Pokemon that you actually want to use together that also just happen to be able to learn these moves isn't easy, resulting in HM slaves being common. Which is yuck. I'm sure some of you wanted me to mention Stealth Rock being too powerful or something, so I guess I'll give it a shout out. But while I do think Stealth Rock became way too prominent in the competitive meta, I don't think the idea of another hazard being more common was inherently bad for the meta. And Stealth Rock's influence definitely wasn't all bad. It was just frustrating to see certain Pokemon getting kicked out of the standard play meta due to it. Surprisingly, we're going to continue to have an easy time picking out the worst mechanics, because for Gen 5, I think I'm pretty settled on giving that to the type gems. Remember those? Increasing the power of the first move of that type by 50% was insane. It was like Z moves before Z moves, and you could just load them up on your team going into a battle. Now, this is only bad because of how it affected balance and competitive stuff. Against NPCs, being overpowered can be pretty fun sometimes. These days, the series likes to pretend most of these don't exist, only really letting the normal gem exist in modern Pokemon. These gems took forever to get banned on Smogon in Black and White OU. In fact, I'm pretty sure, if I recall, they only got banned like 2 years ago or something. That's kind of insane to think about. But I think it was definitely the right move because it was one of several things combined that made the game unhealthy competitively in Gen 5. For a runner-up, it's probably going to be the introduction of Scald. With 80 power and a 30% chance to burn, there is no denying that Scald was a pretty controversial move among a bunch of other crazy stuff Gen 5 already introduced. Scald was almost entirely removed from the game in Scarlet and Violet, which in itself was kind of controversial, as it had been around so long already. But I think most people were okay with it no longer being around. As we move to Generation 6, I think we can agree that it's similar to Gen 2's problem, where Gen 2 can be too easy or suddenly leave you underleveled for your opponent. Gen 6 is more straightforward in that it's consistently just too easy. A lot of this is due to the experience share of the game being way too powerful. But the thing is, without it, the game can feel a bit too grindy to get your Pokemon where you want them. So most people will just leave it on. No one wants their turn-based RPG to feel that mechanically tedious. There's no solid balance for it, so most of the time you're playing, it really feels like you're towering over your opponents. It's enough for non-competitive players to think Mega Evolutions maybe weren't such a great mechanic, especially since you're handed them in the story. Of course, Mega Evolutions are actually a pretty cool mechanic, but the game makes you tower over so many of your opponents that every advantage you can take feels way too insane. I really wish the experience share was nerfed just a little bit before they released the final version of the game. And then later on, when you beat the game, it could be buffed to make grinding other Pokemon after a certain point of the post-game easier. Yeah, you can just turn it off completely, but it doesn't change that the way the mechanic was handled was way too crazy. Gen 6 did some other stuff that people may have problems with, like disagreeing with how they handled the weather nerf. but I just think the game's low difficulty level with experience share on overshadows any other flaw you could point out if you're sticking to just mechanical and gameplay related things. And it really affects people's views of the games their first time through. And I'm not sure if the experience sharing system was ever fully perfected or agreed on with all the games that would come after X and Y. For Gen 7, I'm not sure if I'm the biggest fan of Z moves, but I don't think they fit for worst mechanic. There is the nerf to Burn's periodic damage, but most people seem to be okay with that one, partly because Scald was still prominent at this time. So I think there's something we can all agree with: the handholding. Perhaps more specifically, the early parts of the game that function more like an unneeded tutorial. The older games were understood well enough by kids without needing so much of this, so I'm not sure why they got so carried away with this in Gen 7. Sword and Shield had some handholdy stuff too, but I think it's at its worst in the Sun and Moon games. And it overall makes some already slow-paced cutscenes feel even longer than they normally should. Now, long cutscenes I don't inherently have a problem with. It's just that the parts that are combined with pointing out the most obvious mechanics of the game and droning on about it really suck. Now we're at Sword and Shield. And no, I'm not gonna count the removal of the national decks as a mechanic change. At least not really. But I will admit, it does kinda blow. Also, even if I decide to, it may be a bit too obvious of a pick for some. But don't worry. My pick is more gameplay related than our last entry. Remember when I felt that Z moves could at least be considered? Well, maybe I feel a little more strongly about Gmax. I forgot just how much some people were rarely on the fence about it going in, because this was also when Megas were removed from the game, which became a very beloved mechanic, so it felt like an extra gimmicky replacement to many. It's hard for me to fully go with the idea of labeling this the worst mechanic though. It does fit with the region thematically and aesthetically, and it's not so broken in doubles, and it did shake up VGC for a bit. It's definitely a bit subjective, since in-game there are definitely people that enjoy this for what it is. But there's also no denying it's an overbearingly powerful mechanic in singles, being banned in most forms of standard play. Now, if you actually like the way Gigantamax was handled, then I've got another one for you: teleport. Technically, this change happened in the Let's Go games, but in Sword and Shield, the move being a negative priority switch was huge, especially with heavy-duty boots being available. This made some matches in the meta really pivot-heavy, which some people may not like, especially if it's something like a Clefable using Wish. Personally, I won't call it broken or anything like that, but I'm not sure if I'd say it makes the competitive meta more fun to play in Generation 8. Both of these picks as a potentially worst mechanic are pretty subjective and depend on the context, however, because there are just so many different ways to play Pokemon. Finally, we're at the most recent games, Scarlet and Violet, and it's actually quite difficult to have any obvious pick here. Even more so than Gen 8, these games aren't so mechanically cut and dry as far as pointing out a single negative and positive element. There isn't an obvious mechanic that exists to be super awesome or super divisive like Megas, Z moves, and Gmax. We have Terras, but it's not really an equivalent to those in my opinion. And while it's not a perfect mechanic, I definitely don't think it's a bad mechanic either. In competitive, it does make certain matchups feel like a guessing game. But there are a ton of other elements to a match that can force you to guess as well, so Terras aren't unique to this. There's also the nerf to PP on certain moves, which was clearly an attempt to reduce stall play in some instances, but I don't really have a major gripe with it. I'm not sure if I'd say I love this choice either. It's a bit rooted in the type of playstyles you like, and if you think those moves having more PP would make the meta a little better or not. I guess I'm cool with it personally. There is also shiny hunting, which has become much easier, but most people like this change, despite shinies being a little less special for some people due to the change. I will say this: if there is one thing that would make shiny hunting the worst mechanic, it would only be in the context of looking in certain areas. Due to the game's performance, looking in certain water-filled areas for something like a Dondozo is really unfun, and sometimes the most miserable thing in the game. Usually, the performance issues don't actually make playing the game that much worse outright, until you shiny hunt in some super unoptimized area. Maybe this has been patched since, but from what I've watched, that's where an otherwise okay mechanic becomes unenjoyable. Otherwise, I don't have one single mechanic bad enough to point out over others to throw under the bus like previous generations. So maybe that's my pick for SV. And those are what I think are probably the worst mechanics of each generation. I tried to keep things like glitches, plot stuff, and other non-gameplay and mostly unintentionally elements out of the equation. But what is your least favorite mechanic in each game? I may have forgotten a few things that people really didn't like, and a lot of this, of course, is very subjective, so please do let me know down below.